The old Volkswagen sputtered as Laura pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Hotel Monte Vista, its headlights barely cutting through the desert dusk. She leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting at the flickering neon sign mounted on the building's facade. Half the letters were dead, only a few glowing faintly in the darkness. "Perfect," she muttered, shutting off the engine and stepping out of the car. Dust swirled around her feet, kicked up by the faint breeze that whispered through the empty lot. The place looked like something out of an old western, a ghost of its former self, with cracked stucco walls and wrought iron balconies that creaked in the wind. But Laura didn't care about appearances. $75 an hour to sit at a desk all night? She'd seen worse jobs, and this one came with free coffee. The lobby was even more outdated than she expected. A heavy mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface scarred and dulled by decades of use. Faded carpets stretched across the floor, their once vivid patterns now a patchwork of muted reds and browns. A ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead, barely stirring the heavy air. Behind the desk sat an older man with a gruff demeanor, his salt and pepper beard flecked with bits of tobacco. His name tag, slightly askew on his shirt, read Frank. He glanced up as Laura approached, his expression unreadable. "You, Laura?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "That's me," she replied, slapping the countertop lightly. "You're still looking for a night clerk, right? I'm your girl." Frank studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You ever worked a night shift before?" Laura shrugged. "Not in a hotel, but I've done plenty of overnight gigs. Trust me, I know how to stay awake." He grunted, seemingly unimpressed, but handed her a clipboard. "Sign this. Pays $75 an hour. Start tonight. Don't screw it up." As she scrawled her name on the paperwork, Frank stood and retrieved a key ring from a hook behind the desk. "It's an easy job. Hand out room keys, make sure the register balances, and don't mess with anything you don't understand." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Frank paused, his expression darkening. "The hotel's got quirks. Follow the rules and you'll be fine." He pulled open the desk drawer and pointed to the inside. Laura leaned over, squinting at the jagged etchings carved into the wood. "Rule 1. The clock in the lobby is wrong. Do not reset it no matter what time it says. Rule 2. If you see a guest walking toward their room twice in a row, ask them to come to the front desk immediately. Rule 3. The elevator must never stop on the 3rd floor after midnight. If it does, send it back down without stepping inside. Rule 4. Always leave room 106 unoccupied, even if the hotel is fully booked. Rule 5. If you hear your name whispered from an empty room, do not respond. Close the door and walk away. Rule 6. Do not serve coffee to the man in the gray suit. If he asks, say the machine is broken. Rule 7. If you see yourself sitting in the lobby, leave the hotel immediately. Laura snorted, shaking her head. "What is this? Some kind of initiation ritual?" Frank didn't laugh. His gaze was steady, his tone sharp. "Just follow the damn rules, kid. They're not a joke." Laura had been at the desk for all of 15 minutes when she noticed the clock. The antique timepiece hung on the wall above the lobby entrance, its brass frame dulled with age. Its hands were frozen at 4:17 p.m., a full 7 hours behind the current time. "Great," she muttered, rolling her eyes. "First night on the job, and nothing works." She stood, brushing dust off her sundress, and reached for the clock, intending to reset it. But as her fingers brushed the brass rim, Frank's voice echoed in her mind. "The clock in the lobby is wrong. Do not reset it." Laura hesitated, her hand hovering mid-air. The rule was stupid, just a leftover superstition from whoever ran this place before Frank. But something about it made her uneasy. Her hand dropped back to her side. "Whatever," she muttered, returning to her seat. She pulled out her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media while the minutes dragged by. The silence in the lobby was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with faint whispers. At 11:45 p.m., Laura was startled by the sound of footsteps. A guest was walking down the hallway, their shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. She glanced up, giving them a polite nod as they passed. Then, a minute later, the same guest walked by again. Same brown coat, same briefcase, same exact pace. Laura frowned, sitting up straighter. Excuse me?" she called out. The guest stopped, their head tilting slightly as though they hadn't expected to be noticed. Slowly, they turned to face her, their expression blank and unreadable. "Is there a problem?" they asked, their voice calm but oddly distant, like a recording. Laura's stomach twisted. She forced a smile, gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. "No problem. Just making sure you're all set." The guest nodded once and continued toward their room, disappearing into the dim hallway. The air felt heavier in their absence, and Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just broken some unspoken rule. Laura couldn't shake the unease. The image of the guest, walking the same path twice, played over and over in her mind. Their voice, detached and lifeless, echoed in the back of her head. The lobby, silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights, felt colder now, as if someone had left a door open to the desert night. She stood up, peering down the hallway where the guest had disappeared. The flickering wall sconces cast long, shifting shadows that made the already dim corridor seem like it stretched endlessly into the dark. Laura hesitated, then decided to check the registry. She grabbed the leather-bound book from under the desk and flipped through the entries. Her finger stopped on the name. James Harrow, room 204. Room 204, she whispered to herself. That's where the guest had gone. Twice. She leaned over the counter, her gaze fixed on the dim hallway. Part of her wanted to go upstairs and check, but the rules carved into the desk were clear. If you saw a guest walking toward their room twice, you were supposed to ask them to come to the desk. "What am I supposed to do now?" she muttered, running a hand through her messy hair. Suddenly, footsteps echoed again. Laura's head snapped up, and her breath caught. The same man, in the same brown coat, emerged from the hallway. He was walking toward her, toward the desk, with that same mechanical rhythm. "Hey!" she called out, louder this time, forcing a smile. "Everything all right? Did you forget something?" The man stopped just a few feet from the desk. His face was pale, almost too pale under the flickering light. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his blank expression making her heart race. Then he smiled, or at least, he tried to. His lips curled awkwardly, as though he wasn't used to the motion. "Everything is fine," he said, his tone flat and monotone. "Good night." He turned and walked away before she could respond. His footsteps faded into the hallway, leaving Laura frozen behind the desk. Something about his smile lingered in her mind. It hadn't been a human smile. It was too wide, too forced. She sat down, her pulse still pounding, and opened the drawer to reread the rules. Her finger traced over the second one. If you see a guest walking toward their room twice in a row, ask them to come to the front desk immediately. Had she followed the rule? She'd spoken to him, hadn't she? But something about the encounter felt incomplete, like she'd missed a crucial step. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows. A creak came from the hallway, followed by the faintest whisper of footsteps. By midnight, the eerie silence of the hotel was starting to get to her. Laura had tried distracting herself with her phone, scrolling endlessly through social media, but her usual coping mechanisms weren't working. The weight of the guests' odd behavior, combined with Frank's cryptic warnings, left her feeling on edge. She stood, stretching her legs, and decided to wander the lobby. Her sandals slapped softly against the tile floor as she paced, trying to shake off the oppressive stillness. That's when she heard the ding. The elevator doors slid open, and Laura froze. She hadn't called the elevator, and as far as she knew, no other guests were awake. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. The number above the door was glowing faintly. 3. Her stomach sank. The elevator must never stop on the 3rd floor after midnight. The elevator doors remained open, as if waiting. Laura's instincts told her to ignore it, but the open doors felt like a challenge, taunting her to investigate. She stepped closer, her sandals squeaking softly on the tile. The inside of the elevator was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulb overhead flickering erratically. The faint smell of rust and stale air wafted out as she peered inside. It was empty, but the mirrored walls reflected her face back at her, distorted and shadowed in the poor light. She hesitated, then reached out to press the lobby button. Her hand trembled as the doors slid shut and the elevator descended. She watched the numbers on the panel blink. 2, 1, L. For a moment, everything seemed fine. Then, just as the doors were about to open, the elevator dinged again and began rising. "What the hell?" she whispered, stepping back as the number 3 lit up again. The doors slid open to reveal the 3rd floor, bathed in faint, flickering light. The hallway beyond was long and empty. The patterned carpet stretched out into the shadows. But there was something wrong with the air. It felt heavy, electric, like a thunderstorm was about to break. A sound came from the hallway. Faint whispers, growing louder, overlapping into an incoherent cacophony. Laura slammed the lobby button repeatedly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder, and she swore she saw movement at the far end of the hallway, shapes twisting and writhing in the shadows. Finally, the doors closed, and the elevator descended. The whispers stopped. When the doors opened to the lobby, Laura stumbled out, her legs shaking. Behind her, the elevator dinged one last time, but she didn't turn around. The rules carved into the desk were burned into Laura's mind, but one stood out more than the others now. Always leave room 106 unoccupied, even if the hotel is fully booked. She didn't know why, but after the elevator incident, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Why that room? What was so special about 106? Sitting behind the desk, she flipped through the guest registry again. Her finger hovered over the most recent entry, Mr. James Harrow, room 106. Her chest tightened. Someone was staying there. Was Frank messing with her? He'd said not to break the rules, but here was proof that someone had. The air in the lobby felt stifling, heavier than before. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She grabbed the key to room 106 from the hook behind the desk, the old brass fob cold against her skin, and headed down the hallway. Her flip-flops slapped against the carpet, the sound swallowed by the suffocating silence. The hall stretched endlessly before her. The sconces along the walls flickered erratically, their pale light illuminating the faded wallpaper. She felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, like someone was watching her. But every time she glanced over her shoulder, the hallway was empty. When she reached room 106, she hesitated. The door was just like all the others, unremarkable, scuffed from years of wear. But the air around it was colder. the faint scent of mildew and something metallic wafting through the crack beneath the door. She knocked lightly. "Hello? Mr. Harrow?" No answer. Her hand trembled as she slid the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked and the door creaked open. The room inside was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and the faint outline of furniture barely visible in the dim light. The air was even colder here, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. "Mr. Harrow?" she called again, stepping inside. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the pillows fluffed, and the desk in the corner was spotless. But something about the space felt wrong. The shadows stretched too far, darker than they should have been, and the silence was oppressive. Her eyes were drawn to the chair in the center of the room, facing the window. It was an ordinary chair, wooden and worn, but something about its placement felt deliberate, like it was waiting for someone. As she approached, her breath caught in her throat. Etched into the chair's backrest, in the same jagged script as the rules at the desk, were the words, "It knows." She stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, crawling along the walls toward her. She turned and bolted, slamming the door shut behind her and sprinting down the hallway. The air grew colder as she ran, her breath visible in the dim light. When she reached the lobby, she leaned against the desk, clutching her chest as she gasped for air. The lobby clock, still stuck at 4:17 p.m., ticked once. Laura had barely caught her breath when the bell above the front door jingled. She jerked upright, her eyes darting toward the entrance. A man had stepped into the lobby, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile. He was tall and lean, his gray suit impeccably tailored. A matching fedora sat low on his head, casting a shadow over his sharp, angular features. His pale skin had an almost waxy sheen, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and precise. He approached the desk slowly, his movements deliberate. "Might I trouble you for a cup of coffee?" Laura's stomach churned. The rule screamed in her mind. Do not serve coffee to the man in the gray suit. If he asks, say the machine is broken. Her throat was dry as she forced a polite smile. "Sorry, the machine's not working tonight." The man's smile faltered, his lips curling slightly at the edges. "Oh, that's unfortunate," he said, his tone flat but with an edge that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps another time." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty lobby. He didn't head toward the door, though. Instead, he walked down the hallway toward the guest rooms, disappearing into the shadows. Laura stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then the printer on the desk came to life, whirring loudly as it spat out a receipt. The paper curled onto the counter, and she grabbed it with trembling hands. The words were printed in bold crimson ink. "You've seen him now. It's too late." The air in the lobby felt suffocating. Laura stared at the receipt, the words burned into her mind. It's too late. What did it mean? What was too late? Her thoughts raced as she clutched the paper, crumpling it in her fist. She stood and paced the room, her sandals squeaking against the tile. The windows rattled as the wind outside picked up, and the flickering lights seemed dimmer than before. She glanced at the mirror behind the desk, catching a glimpse of her own reflection. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection stood behind the desk, staring straight at her, its face blank and expressionless. Slowly, it tilted its head, mimicking a gesture she hadn't made. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't happening." The reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of the lips that sent a chill down her spine. Then it stood up and pointed toward the front door. Her heart pounded as she stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair behind her. She didn't wait to see what the reflection would do next. Grabbing her keys, she bolted for the door, the faint sound of laughter echoing in her ears. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Laura's Volkswagen rattled and groaned as she sped down the empty highway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She gripped the wheel tightly, her mind racing. What had she just seen? How could that other woman, the one sitting in the parked car, be her? It wasn't possible. Nothing about the last few hours was possible. The wind outside howled, whipping sand across the road. Her headlights illuminated a distant sign that read, "Flagstaff City Limits, 15 miles." She pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to put the Hotel Monte Vista behind her. But then, just as the sign disappeared in her rearview mirror, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, sharp and loud, cutting through the silence. Laura glanced at the radio dial, her stomach twisting. She hadn't turned it on. She reached out to switch it off, but a voice broke through the static, distorted and mechanical. "Subject 27, you have deviated from the controlled zone. Return immediately." She froze, her hand hovering over the dial. The voice repeated itself, clearer this time. "Subject 27, this is Control. You are outside of the experiment parameters. Return to the Monte Vista facility immediately." Her blood ran cold. "What the hell?" she whispered, slamming her hand against the radio. The static hissed and popped before the voice cut out, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence once again. But then, ahead on the road, something appeared. A figure stood in the center of the highway, illuminated by her headlights. Laura's heart lurched as she slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car skidded to a stop just feet from the figure, a man in a gray suit. It was him, the man from the hotel. He stared at her, his expression blank, his posture unnaturally stiff. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed back down the highway, toward the direction she had come from. The direction of the hotel. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "I'm not going back." The man didn't move, didn't flinch. Then, without warning, her car's engine died. The dashboard lights flickered, and the radio crackled back to life. This time, the voice was louder, angrier. "Subject 27, you are in violation of Experiment Protocol 3. Return immediately or face termination." Her stomach churned as she leaned back in her seat, her pulse pounding in her ears. Experiment? Protocol? What the hell was going on? Desperate for answers, Laura climbed out of the car, the desert wind stinging her face. The man in the gray suit was still standing there, his hand outstretched toward her. Slowly, he lowered it and spoke. "You've seen too much, Laura. You were never supposed to know." Her legs trembled as she took a step back. "What are you talking about? Who are you? What is this place?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "The Hotel Monte Vista is not what you think it is," he said. "It is a temporal observation facility, part of a controlled experiment conducted by NASA's Special Projects Division." Her mind reeled. NASA? What the hell does NASA have to do with a creepy old hotel? The man's gaze didn't waver. "This is not a hotel. It is a facade, a construct designed to observe and manipulate subjects within a controlled time loop. You, Subject 27, are part of a long-term experiment to test human responses to temporal anomalies." Laura's breath hitched. "You're lying. This is insane." But deep down, something clicked. The strange rules, the distorted reflections, the repeating guests. It all made a sick kind of sense. The hotel wasn't haunted. It was a machine, a carefully constructed illusion designed to trap her and others like her in a loop. "You can't keep me here," she spat, her voice trembling. The man in the gray suit took a step closer. "You were never meant to leave, Laura. The experiment only works if the subjects remain within the controlled zone. You deviated, and now the system is destabilizing." He gestured to the horizon, and Laura's eyes widened. The desert around her was flickering, like a glitching computer screen. The stars overhead blinked in and out of existence, and the mountains in the distance wavered like mirages. "The temporal field is collapsing," the man said. "You must return to the facility to stabilize it." Laura shook her head, backing away. "No, I'm not going back there. I won't." The man's expression didn't change. "You have no choice." She turned and ran, her bare feet pounding against the asphalt. The wind roared in her ears, and the world around her continued to glitch and warp. The man in the gray suit didn't follow, but his voice echoed in her mind. "You cannot outrun time. Subject 27. Her car was dead, her escape route blocked, but as she crested a small hill, she saw something in the distance, a low building, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. It wasn't the hotel. It was something else, something sleek and modern, with tall antennas jutting into the sky. Her heart pounded as she sprinted toward it, the desert flickering and distorting around her. When she reached the building, she saw a sign mounted above the door. NASA Temporal Research Facility, Site Alpha. The truth hit her like a freight train. The hotel wasn't just a facade. It was part of a larger operation, a cover for experiments that twisted time itself. She pushed through the doors, stumbling into a sterile white hallway lined with monitors and machinery. On the screens, she saw herself, walking through the hotel lobby, sitting at the desk, entering room 106. Her voice echoed through the hall, faint and distorted. "You can't keep me here." But it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from one of the monitors. The hallway flickered, and the man in the gray suit appeared at the far end. "Welcome back, Subject 27, he said. "It's time to begin again." Laura screamed as the world dissolved into static, her mind fracturing under the weight of the endless loop.